I'd like to welcome all of you guys to session 3 of our Natural Hazards Resilience speaker series, and it's loosely titled Using Local Planning Tools to Build Community Resilience, more or less, may have a twist on that. And today we have a wonderful surprise in store, as the presentation is going to be a double header. Yay! So this is a real 2-for-1 bonus we've got going here, and I'm very appreciative of both of our speakers and the addition of one of the primary developers of the original PIRS plan, the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, Jaimie Masterson. Joe and Jaimie have agreed to tag team today as they are currently working together on a project led by Dr. Phil Berke. He's in the planning department here at Carolina. And they are working on a project that is run through the Coastal Resilience Center, and it's funded by the Department of Homeland Security. And it's to infuse PIRS into APA's course offerings and make that available to more communities nationwide. That's the gist of it. But I'll let you tell them. I'll let them tell you about that. So let me give you a real quick introduction to Joe DeAngelis. Is it DeAngelis?
DeAngelis, that's it. Yep.
Okay. He's a certified planner, and he is joining us today from Chicago, where it is what, 25 below?
Yeah, no, not too bad today.
Okay. They're made of hardy stock up there. He's been a senior research associate for the American Planning Association, flood resilience planner at the New York City Department of City Planning, specializing in community planning and long-term post-Sandy recovery and resilience for coastal communities on Staten Island. Joe has a BA in political science from the University of Delaware and a Master's of Urban Planning, Environment, and Sustainability from City University of New York, Hunter College. Did I get that right, Joe?
Absolutely.
Okay. Jaimie Hicks Masterson is also a certified planner. She wears numerous hats at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. So I'll let you look it up, how many directorates and associate directors and all these wonderful things, activities that she's involved in, because I will run out of breath by the time I get through her introduction. She's earned a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture and a Master of Urban Planning from Texas A&M. She states that her long-term goals are to work alongside communities to mitigate the effects of hazards. And I quote, "After all, disasters are a product of our development patterns. If we can understand the complex network of patterns which lead to community vulnerabilities, whether of people or property, we can save lives," unquote. Her book, Planning for Community Resilience, a handbook for reducing vulnerability to disasters, is a must-read for anyone involved in the resilience field. So I hope I didn't botch that too much, Jaimie. So I'm going to start sharing my slides, and we're going to have Joe's presentation first. Then we're going to switch over to Jaimie's slides. And after that, we'll have some time for some questions, I hope. They're probably going to have to fly through their presentations because they have lots of really, really good material and not that much time to get through it all. So here goes. I'm going to share, and here you are, Joe. Okay. Go ahead.
Stuff. All right, hold on one second. Okay, I'm unmuted. Good. All right. Thanks, Anna, for having me. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about APA as an organization, where I've worked for the last 5 years in the research department, some of our climate adaptation and resilience work, and how it kind of connects to the ongoing project that we have at Jaimie and Phil on the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard. So just a little bit of context about what APA is. We're a national member organization for community planners in the US, about 46,000 members, and we have state and regional chapters across the US in all 50 states. We also have 21 divisions. These are member organized groups and they cover shared topic areas and areas of interest among our membership. I tend to work with a couple of them. I tend to work with some of them more than others. So two of the divisions here that I regularly work with are the Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Planning Division and the Environment, Natural Resources, and Energy Division. So they have some special topical overlap with the work that I do, and they're groups that we like to regularly engage. You could go to the next slide.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, shoot. Is it going? There we go.
Oh, yeah. I won't spend a lot of time on this. We also oversee the operations of AICP, so it's the organization that certifies planners in the U.S. We've got more than 16,000 AICPs across the U.S., and these are people who are, you're required to maintain your certification through education and training on well-established topics, but more recently, emerging topics in lots of different topical areas. So to come, there's going to be required education on things like climate resilience, just like there is a required education on planning and law and ethics. So it's an interesting area that we're trying to focus a little bit more on in mandatory education for our members. We also have recently deployed in the last couple of years APA Learn, which is a learning management system here at APA that we use for most of our education. It's similar to like a Coursera type model of online education, and that's it's got hundreds of courses, and it's been really great for us to have that as well. Next slide, please. So this is the area that I primarily work in. APA, we do a lot of our own research on the planning practice generally and on topics and subfields that planners tend to work in. So for me, that's mostly climate resilience, adaptation. And for now, I'm going to go through like the basics of a few recent projects that serve as a good bit of background, I think, on the work, on my work and our work as a research department in the climate and hazard space, and that tie in towards the end. You'll see in the presentation, they tie in with the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard project that we're working on. So first up is this multi-hazard planning framework that we have. So this is an in-depth guidebook that we developed to help understand and to help planners understand and mitigate risks in the wildland-urban interface. For those who aren't aware, the wildland-urban interface, that's a zone across the United States. It's this transition zone between wildlands and human development. Basically areas where houses and wildlands intermingle or are mixed in some way. The main focus of this guidebook is wildfire for obvious reasons, but we've also developed some guidance on related hazards like flash flood, landslide, drought. That's why it's called a multi-hazard guidebook. It breaks things down according to a pretty good range of local interventions and looks at how not just plans can be tailored to address WUI risk, but potential local development regulations that communities might want to consider, types of public investments that might be used that can be used to reduce and mitigate natural hazard risks in these areas. Next slide, please. So the framework itself includes this interesting set of pre-made audit documents that we kind of intend for local planners to use to assess the strengths of their local wildland-urban interface policies that they have. So how their regulations might or might not mitigate wildfire risks, whether they're public investments, things like local infrastructure, public buildings, roads, transit, whether those things are considering local natural hazard risk in planning and prioritizing their infrastructure projects. That's the gist of what that audit piece of that document is. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting project that we just wrapped up last year called Using Climate Information in Local Planning. This is a NOAA project in partnership with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. In developing this guidebook, we worked directly with 5 different pilot communities in the Chicago metro area to try to identify some of the primary barriers that were preventing them from taking climate information, which is usually at the global and regional scale, and using it in their plans, zoning codes, infrastructure policies, development regulations. And we found that this is a really tough one to crack, I think, because this is information that's really good at the global and regional levels. But even at that scale, you're dealing with a lot of variables. So how much greenhouse gas emissions might be reduced, and how much those reductions might affect temperature, how much and how quickly ice will melt and oceans will expand because of those increased temperatures, how much sea level rise will actually occur based on ice melt and thermal expansion, these kinds of things. So as you get closer and closer to the local level, the level at which most plans are made, the data becomes even more uncertain, less precise, less specific. For example, we can say in the Great Lakes that we expect more rain annually and more powerful storms, but we can't say the precise number of inches a community might see in, say, 2045. We can give a range, but it's really difficult to say. It's really difficult to plan with. It's difficult to plan, say, a transit project in a specific year based on a very wide range of projections that's somewhat far off in the future. So in the guidebook, we try to talk to planners about the data that's actually available, how to use it responsibly and effectively at the local level, how to talk about it with their elected officials, how to give it the right context and plans, basically just how to understand this information better. Ultimately, the next goal is, if you could just go to the next slide, actually, that'd be great. The goal here is to connect the act of making plans with the act of implementation. So making plans a reality is a big concern for us. So developing plans and overseeing their eventual implementation, we think, is the backbone of, a planner's work. And all too often, we found that through our research, plans and implementation at the local level operate almost independently from one another. So in the context of climate change, this is a really big problem. So if the infrastructure that's being built today isn't accounting for direct climate change impacts in the form of road elevation to account for sea level rise, or indirect impacts such as population growth or loss due to persistent flooding in some specific area, then the links among plans and then the links between plans implementation, those things aren't happening at all at the local level, and that's a big problem. So without any agreement among a suite of local plans, and without clear and actionable links between plans and implementation, then planning really can't do all that much. Next slide, please. So I'm really proud of this report. This is a report that I co-authored and came out last year, PAS 596, Planning for Infrastructure Resilience, also the product of a NOAA grant that we had. This report's targeted at planners and floodplain managers and is intended to provide guidance in 4 major areas. Explicit guidance on the state of climate science with regard to infrastructure across the US. So we rely heavily on the most recent National Climate Assessment for this, and I definitely suggest at least skimming that and giving it a look because it's really fantastic. The importance of assessing vulnerability across the community to help inform future plans and implementation. The uses of different types of plans in forming a body of work that can then be consulted in the implementation process. And finally, the actual infrastructure planning process itself, which in most communities is a distinct thing. The act of prioritizing projects, paying for them, and putting shovels in the ground. Next slide. Thanks. So based on this work, we found, we kind of nailed down these 4 big disconnects, is what I like to call them, that we see as preventing more comprehensive attempts to realize more resilient infrastructure. And the first is that the work of community planning doesn't always overlap with the work of infrastructure and capital planning. So planning departments might not be a part of the CIP process, or planning departments might be a part of the process, but really only the planning director is involved, and it's not getting any further down the chain than that planning director. The folks who are crafting a comprehensive plan or knowledgeable about a specific community might not be involved at all in that process. Next slide. Next, climate adaptation planning might not have any connection with infrastructure planning either. So it might deal in generalities about the need for resilient infrastructure, or it might identify areas of high risk in a community, but the identification of some vulnerability somewhere, and it's not going anywhere other than just identifying that vulnerability. It's not saying anything or forcing any process change in the infrastructure process to actually make an impact on the ground. Next slide. This leads right into the next one here. Anna? Yep, there, sorry. So there might just be a tenuous connection between the act of planning, doing climate adaptation planning, and the process of prioritizing projects, scoping projects, designing them, and building them. So what role is the adaptation plan playing in modifying a CIP process, the capital improvements process? What role does the adaptation plan have in requiring project managers to account for sea level rise in coastal hazards? So these might sound like procedural things, But we found that it's those procedural things that constitute the bulk of the work on a day-to-day basis in a community. So it's not just the plans themselves, but how we're actually changing processes to build adaptation directly into the scoping process and the prioritization process and the construction process as well. Next slide. Finally, this is the last one. There's a big disconnect between the availability of climate science and their use in planning. So planners might not have any expertise in using this information at all. They might be overwhelmed with the resources that are available, or might be lost in the uncertainty and the wideness of the range of the available data. They might not be empowered to use this information locally by their director or their city manager or their city council. It might not be trusted in the same way that more well-established sources of hazards information are, that are written into development handbooks that your engineering staff has. Climate information just isn't used in that same way, even though we argue in the report that it probably should be. And there might be no regulatory link requiring or standardizing the use of climate information in local planning. Next slide, please. So with all these swirling ideas around about how data works with plans, how plans align and work together, how they might connect with policies and regulations, that brings us, I think, to the project that we're working on with Jaimie. So our goal at APA with this work is to try to establish the scorecard as a state-of-the-art method that's actually accessible to planners and the communities that they serve. So it's not something that's inherently limited anymore by on-site training or workshops or long-term engagement with communities, even though that's really valuable still, but something that planners everywhere might have a chance to learn about and access their training on. Next slide. So who's our audience for this? Really the APA membership that we have and those who are working in allied professions. So obviously community planners across the spectrum of planning. We know that planning is a very wide and deep field. So we are not really targeting this at any specific type of planner. That's our primary audience, is our membership, and those are in allied professions. So people who write long-range community plans, they develop and administer zoning and land use codes, they work on transportation plans and adaptation plans, they help coordinate capital infrastructure investments, they specialize in community engagement, things like that. Allied professions, floodplain management, engineering, architecture, local elected officials who are especially interested and looking to be a local champion for this kind of work. These are the people who work with planners to try to determine their goals, develop plans, budgets, and codes. And finally, especially given the discussion today, I don't want to forget faculty and students at planning school. So by building out the national reach of the scorecard model, I think that the next generation of planners will really be exposed to the methods that are used as part of the scorecard, critical topics on plan integration and alignment, how spatial analysis might be able to be used to improve the effectiveness of plans and codes. Next slide. So these are just some of our activities and milestones that we have for this project. We're through phase 1 of this project now. So developing a framework that guides how the scorecard, along with some of those different publications and tools I mentioned before, can be used in combination with each other. So the planning framework, the PAS report, our recent policy guide on climate change, for example, that I think I sent over to Anna before. We conducted a survey of our members early on in this project, a series of interviews with practicing planners. We held a roundtable discussion with folks who are in this field, who have worked with the scorecard before, all to try to nail down just how we can develop education on the scorecard and integrate it into our other resources here at APA. Next slide. You can go to the next slide, Anna. Thanks. So finally, our ultimate milestone with this is, with the first phase of the project, is this Planning Advisory Service publication. This PAS memo was just published in January. So this report kind of focuses on how a scorecard can be used in multiple community contexts in combination with APA's well-established tools that we have. So publications that are widely read, free to our members. It seems like the ideal format for at least setting up phase 2 of this project. The report basically boils down to a foundation for expanding and integrating the scorecard into APA's wider guidance. Primarily, it's educational outreach to our members. All of our outcomes and impacts kind of flow out of embedding PIRS in this future guidance and education piece. And the next slide, I believe, is our last one. So what are we working on here? What are some of the outcomes expected for the next year of the project? So first, we're working to create this web-based education piece now. We're working with our education department, Jaimie, Phil, and other folks here at APA. As part of this, we want to tie in related information, content from other publications, feature some case studies from the communities that Jaimie and Phil have worked with, really just try to mainstream this on a larger scale than it currently is. And next is really direct integration of this into our future research activities here at APA. So looking at other projects that we have and trying to find a way to fit the scorecard in as best as we possibly can. I'm not going to continue on this point too much longer. I think it might make sense now if I were to turn it over to Jaimie, who probably will be able to talk about the scorecard itself in more detail. Thanks.
Great job, Joe, going through a lot of material and very succinctly. Appreciate it. Okay, Jaimie, you want to share yours? There we go.
Okay, I was like, where's the unmute button? Okay, thanks for having me today. Really appreciate it. I'll go kind of quickly through these because I see we're running out of time. But yeah, I think setting this up really nicely in terms of what is this scorecard? What is it that we're doing? And what is that APA is going to begin rolling out as a part of their education model? So you'll begin to see a lot more of this as planners and as practicing planners in the coming years. So you're kind of getting a sneak peek of some of the things that we'll be folding out. But so the whole idea, the whole problem is that there really is a plethora of plans across all of our communities, and that all of these plans, while very well intentioned, are often very siloed, and they're not coordinated in a way to address disasters, hazards, reducing hazard risk, and therefore mitigating those risks. And so oftentimes what we're seeing is that mitigation planning is kind of just within the realm of what the emergency managers are doing in their hazard mitigation planning requirements, but we're not necessarily seeing them across the board. And if we are seeing mitigation actions happening within a comprehensive plan or a parks and recreation plan, oftentimes they're not coordinated and working together. And so they're kind of inefficient in a way. So even small communities have many types of plans. And just to kind of demonstrate the conflicts that we see over and over again, this is coming from Hurricane Sandy. Phil, soon after that event, was looking at a New Jersey hazard mitigation plan, thinking, did they even know that they were at risk? Did they know that they were going to have such terrible impacts? And so the map on the left is kind of showing you where the special flood hazard area is, the 100-year floodplain in blue. And so obviously they had designated that, they had identified it. If on the map on the right is the comprehensive plan, and there was no mention of hazards within the comprehensive plan, but instead it was focused on all the things that us planners absolutely love and go into the profession to do, sort of walkable, mixed use environments, redeveloped areas to spur economic growth and affordable housing and all of these things that were happening and promoting, and there was just no connection between the two. So the idea behind the scorecard, we just call anecdotally the scorecard, colloquially the scorecard, but it's the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, or PIRS, is that we're basically stacking or reading through all the plans. That's for step one. And then we pull all the policies, those implementation actions that Joe was kind of getting at, and we're seeing how they're impacting particular neighborhoods or particular parts of the community, and if they're exacerbating vulnerabilities or not. And so we can kind of stack all of those policies together and see what's going on for particular areas. And then you get different types of maps. So in these maps, you're seeing that the red is obviously the worst. So those were policies that were more in conflict and increasing vulnerabilities. And the areas in blue were reducing vulnerabilities. I'm not going to go in too much detail of the methods, but just know that we have applied the method across the world into many different types of communities, sizes, mostly coastal, and we're beginning to think about how to work more inland and with different types of hazards. You can check out the guidebook that walks you through how to actually do this method. So if you have an interest in doing this, we've worked with an advisory board to kind of translate it from the research into something that's going to be very useful for practitioners. And then APA is basically taking the ball and they're going to take it really out and evangelize and make it even more user-friendly than what we've done. But ultimately, the main outcomes is, I guess, what I want to focus on for you today is the outputs is that, we're training folks, we're providing this sort of new method. It's a new database, a new way to understand the policies that are within your current set of plans. But ultimately, it's the conversations that are had and the way in which we're changing, here, I'll use my cursor here, changing integration in thinking about mitigation within those networks and making those tweaks and small changes in the current existing network of plans and how in which we're reducing vulnerabilities. And what comes of that is typically the way we change our regulations, whether it be zoning or building codes, whether it's changing how we're doing our permit review processes or the different incentives that we're providing to developers or otherwise. And with the ultimate goal of obviously reducing vulnerability across the board. So I'm going to show two quick examples, if I'm allowed. This first one is from Norfolk, Virginia. As you probably know, with 100 Resilient Cities, Norfolk is really a leader in thinking about climate change. They have, if you haven't checked it out, their Vision 2100, where they're literally planning for sea level rise, what their community is going to look like in year 2100. So we had the great opportunity to work with their staff, and we had 9 different staff from the planning department and emergency management department and the 100 Resilient Cities that participated with us to go through and score all of their plans. And now they scored relatively well. What you're seeing here is that we had to change the color scheme because they scored so well across their plans. But that didn't necessarily matter because it revealed other things. It was about the conversations that were had. For instance, the planners had not read the hazard mitigation plan. The emergency manager had no idea and had not read these other plans. And this is a high capacity city that is thoughtful and thinking about resilience. So I'm not meaning to point them out as being, making bad choices here or making, not thinking about this. It's an example of how siloed we are. And if Norfolk is not even doing it, then can you imagine the number and amount of communities that are not doing it today? And so you as planners, I hope you, when you go out and practice, you kind of are waving your flag to recognize the role that you play, but also the role that you can play as a convener and facilitator, understanding the full range of plans that you have in your community and the ways in which they interact together. The other thing that was interesting about Norfolk, and I'll just show you this slide, you can kind of read through them as I talk, but when we did the social vulnerability analysis on top of it, what they realized was that the neighborhoods that had lower plan integration scores basically were the socially vulnerable neighborhoods. They had fewer policies overall, and they had fewer policies focused on reducing their risk. So essentially, the city used that data and information to apply for a HUD grant, and they are now in the process of developing what they're calling their resilience park in what would be considered a socially vulnerable neighborhood. And so we see that as a big win of revealing things that maybe otherwise you wouldn't have seen. I won't go through Nashua, though that's a really great example. If there's anyone from New Hampshire, I can provide these slides later. But I'd like to show you, because this one's a bit more visual, show you about Rockport, Texas. So a pretty small city, less than 10,000 in population. They were the direct hit of Hurricane Harvey in 2017. The whole community, was just very much destroyed. And so we had the opportunity to work with them and also work with them as they were going through a new comprehensive planning process. And so here are a set of maps. These are the products of the analysis that we do. And what you're seeing are the large map on the left is the composite map. And then the 4 maps kind of in the middle are the different plans that we were analyzing. So what you're seeing is the darker the green, obviously the better at reducing vulnerabilities, and the pink color is what is exacerbating vulnerabilities. So there was a key plan, the Heritage District and Downtown Master Plan, that was really not really thinking about hazards at all, and they're right there on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And so that was a key plan that we could look to, tweak, and make changes within that plan so that they were working in concert. So the examples on the left are just some examples of policies that we see within these plans that we're often pulling, and that you can see there within the downtown plan. There was just really no focus on hazards. It was all just about development. And there was no thought to, elevating or any other sort of mitigation action. While in some of the other plans, like the hazard mitigation plan and the floodplain management plan, they were obviously more thoughtful, talking about ways in which they can update their zoning regulations to move folks out of harm's way, do property buyouts and such. So good things, but not coordinated, and real opportunities to work together that was not happening. So in the development of their comprehensive plan, and I'll stop in 1 minute, essentially at the back of the comprehensive plan, there's a giant implementation table of all the actions that they're going to be doing. And we created a column to sort of call out the plans as a way to also remind these Texas City Council members of this action item is important, and it also relates to these other plans that are already in your community that you've already adopted. And lastly, throughout the document, we also have these little text boxes that call out, this particular strategy is related to these other plans. And so that's why we're calling it out again in the comprehensive plan. So just some tweaks and changes and strategies to fold it in to remind folks why we're doing what we're doing and why it's important. And that if they're going to vote against something, that they're going to be voting against lots of different folks along the way. So I'll stop there, and I don't have to necessarily share my screen anymore. And we can take questions now.
Super. Thank you so much, Jaimie and Joe. I'm going to start off by an observation I had when I received submitted questions, pre-presentation questions from the students, which is one of their homework assignments or participation assignment. And I noticed that we'd had several overlapping questions that dealt with issues of capacity or lack thereof to undertake big steps like PIRS involves, as well as issues involving equity, disparity, et cetera, within communities, which you both touched on a little bit, but I do have some more specific questions that deal with that. And I'll start with Julia Cardwell. If you want to call out your question, or I can read it off for you. And this is your first bullet that you submitted.
Oh, you can go ahead. I don't have it right in front of me.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
So you asked, what are ways to address the impacts of capacity issues in local planning? Some localities don't have the expertise, staffing, or funding to undertake comprehensive local planning, and this may be skewed towards more socially vulnerable areas who could benefit most from this type of planning. Are there solutions to this? Big question. Go solve the problems of planning. So Joe or Jaimie, you want to take that on?
Well, I guess I'll say my main job is actually to work with low capacity communities in Texas that, as you can imagine, planning is not a very popular thing to do in Texas. So there's not really the capacity at these smaller scale communities or even neighborhoods to do it, but also consultants aren't really going there because these places also don't have the funds. And so our program, it's called Texas Target Communities. We're trying to provide that gap to do planning for places, and particularly we like to focus on places that are within that urban rural fringe where they're facing that development pressure and they're quickly going to be run over by development. So, but other than that, what I would say for PIRS, when we think about it, is the way we've tried to design it is to kind of use what you've got. What do you have on the books that you're using, and what tweaks and changes can you make within it? So kind of starting, you don't have to have some brand new fancy resilience plan in order to work toward that. But what do you have, and what small changes can you make? And so that's kind of where we start. And I'll let Joe kind of jump in from there.
Yeah, thanks, Jaimie. I mean, I don't have too much to add to that other than, most of the publications that I also mentioned here, we take the argument of it doesn't have to be everything or nothing in your local adaptation, efforts or your resilience efforts. My cat's trying to get into the room right now. But smaller iterative steps where possible. I mean, we're entirely sympathetic with those communities, because even those iterative steps are really challenging sometimes, that a local planner might want to take, but just not have any backup or the ability to do it, or there might not even be a local planner on staff, to be honest. So it is a big challenge. What we're trying to do with this project, I think, is try to maybe make this a little bit less resource dependent than it might already be. So it doesn't require, an in-depth workshop or something like that. It's making this available to folks across the US who are planners to at least get a basic understanding of the scorecard, and then try to understand ways that they might be able to apply it in their specific circumstance. So we're not going to solve the problem of low capacity communities with this, but I think that this is an attempt to address it in some limited way, to meet people where they are in their communities and not necessarily give them an overly prescriptive approach to doing this work.
Great question, great answers, thank you. My next one that I selected is from Zuri Garcia. Do you want to read your question out, that last bullet you had?
Would you be able to read it for me?
Sure. So her question is, do you have any advice how to best facilitate climate change related conversations when the area you are in does not believe in the concept? Again,
Yes, I think that's
easy.
I work with lots of low capacity communities throughout the state. We have worked, and basically the places we're working are the ones that don't like to have those kinds of conversations. But we're also working in the places that are affected by disasters. In Rockport, Texas, it was, they were having the sort of sunny day, high tide flooding in their downtown. It was coming up their sewers. And so while we might not use the word climate change or sea level rise, we're still talking about how, there's been changes happening in the community. What can we do? What future changes do we think might occur? Do we think it's going to get worse? And okay, so what are some, stronger measures that we can take to make sure that we're protecting our small town, wonderful community that we all love. In Liberty County, which is just northeast of the Houston area, they're basically getting the third loop around Houston, going through their community, and their judge, the county judge is essentially the mayor, a quasi judicial and an executive branch for Texas, but he had his big belt buckle and cowboy hat, and had been there for multiple generations, and was just like, we want a place that our kids and grandkids would be proud to live in. And while he's not saying sustainability and he's not saying climate change, he's saying the same sorts of meanings. If there's they want to keep their place. People love their homes and their place, and so if we can drill down back to the root of that and kind of get rid of some of the trigger words, that's the way we've been able to still have these conversations and get at, okay, what actions do we need to take to protect our communities and keep it so that our kids and grandkids can live there.
Great, thanks.
All I'll really add to that is that when I was a planner on the east shore of Staten Island after Hurricane Sandy, it was a similar-ish situation to kind of what Jaimie was describing there. It's tough to talk about it in this way, but when there's been a very recent disaster, it is an opportunity to have some of these more difficult conversations, right? Because Hurricane Sandy, I remember the flooding extent was basically a 1 in 500 year type flood. Rather than the 1 in 100 year type flood. So the people who were covered in the map within the 1 in 100 year flood were saying, well, how did the flood go past that area? Well, because the map was made in 1981 and there have been a lot of changes since then. Local development changes, but also changes in sea level, changes in storm severity and things like that. So we use that as an opportunity to engage these communities and saying, well, what's it going to look like in 10 and 15 and 20 and 30 years from now? You hate to give up ground on talking about something as factual as climate change, right? So you don't necessarily want to avoid using those terms entirely, even though you may find yourself in that situation. But trying to engage with people at the local level who do exist in organizations that might exist also to try to be advocates for that kind of work is also really important, because their voices might just be entirely blocked out by the powers that be locally, even though those people are there. They do exist in these communities too. So there's another area. Again, no easy answers for it, but there's incremental potential there. So.
I would say though too that it sometimes always, or it can boil down to just trusted relationships that you have with folks. And so if you're, and there's whole methods on, or ways in which you can gain trust or develop trust. And typically it means you're having conversations with folks and you're sticking around. And you're not just sort of in and out, providing assistance here and there, that you're, they know you're there for the long haul to really help. So for that kind of real local change that needs to take place, it really revolves around solid relationships with folks.
Can I have a follow-up question? Is that okay?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm not sure what the format is here, but
I don't either. We're just winging it.
awesome. Well, I guess, thinking about what y'all are talking about, what, in those communities where those kinds of like trigger words like climate change, resilience, global warming would kind of be very off-putting to them, and would like basically like they could shut down and like then the problem doesn't get solved. So is there a follow-up to go back and just kind of like meet them where they're at that point, and then kind of like continuously like progress the conversation towards being able to use those terms? Because, I find it like, I know exactly who you're talking about when you say like who in Texas, especially. And I just think like, if you have those solid relationships that are built on trust, then there has to be a pathway to get there. So like, I guess that's what I'm curious about. Like, what would that look like? And is that something you've attempted to do or?
Yeah, and for Liberty County, we did a sort of bathtub model of what the future floodplain would look like in year 2100, and we just kind of put it out there. And I didn't necessarily say like due to climate change, but this is what that NOAA is projecting it could look like. And so providing that as a scenario, the way we kind of approached it was through scenario planning, as if the community is going to have floodplains like this, what would you do? What areas would you protect? What choices would you make now? And so, yeah, I think having incremental meetings toward that, but I still think you can get at the solutions that we're hoping for without necessarily, and still bringing people to the table and using common language that folks feel comfortable with. I still think that you can do that without using, trigger words. So I don't know if that's.
Yep.
Great follow-up question as well. I know, climate communication, science communication in the bigger picture is a whole discipline unto itself. And in the day of misinformation that we're getting, it's even more carefully planned language that'll probably come across to more people. And maybe I'm just being naive, but yeah, this is a hot topic and really needs addressing across the board.
In that local climate science project that I was talking about earlier, one of the main topics wasn't necessarily communication with the public, but climate science producers, right? The people who are developing this information, developing the right terminology and language to communicate with local practitioners, planners, engineers. They're using totally different vocabularies to talk about things and in different timeframes and different ranges about really complicated topics. So the planners in a community need to understand this stuff first. So that involves like the solutions that are being advanced right now involves like a constant dialogue between those different groups of practitioners. And that's happening. It's not like I'm saying it should happen. It's actually happening right now. And as planners, I think, get up to speed and local staff start to get up to speed, I think that hopefully we'll start to see that conversation shifting towards the public in a meaningful way too.
Great, thanks for that response. Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit to more of a nuts and bolts type of question. And Fern, your question about Norfolk, do you want to read it or do you want me to read it out for you? It was your second bullet.
Sorry, read it, that would be great.
Sure, no problem. Norfolk, Virginia was, Norfolk, Virginia was held up as a case study in the PIRS memo on building resilience through plan integration. A new zoning ordinance that accounts for differences in resilience is mentioned as one of the outcomes of their plan integration process. Can you share more about this ordinance and what sets out to achieve or correct, and how does it do that? They're asking such easy questions, aren't they?
Just let them think about it beforehand. So yes, the new zoning ordinance is essentially has a resilience. I forget the way they use it. Maybe like a quotient or a metric that basically when they're going through the development review process, they have to meet certain aspects in that site review that deal with resilience. So they're getting all the way down to how it's actually moving through the development review. And so additionally, through their Vision 2100, they identified areas essentially that they would be willing to like let go of and not invest in any longer, let the infrastructure go essentially, and areas that they're going to sort of prioritize, whether it be because of the economic necessity, the naval base being there and the port being there, or because it was also higher ground. So that is also changing their zoning and their what will be their land use. But yeah, I think what the question you were kind of getting at was the resilience quotient component, and that is new and innovative. And I haven't followed up with them on how, because it's been about a year now since they've been implementing it and how they've been able to do that. So
as far as I know about that, I believe it's an incentive-based scoring system, I think, too, right? So like you get certain development benefits if you're taking certain actions in areas that you're building. I don't think it's punitive. So I think that it's extra things that you are doing are giving you certain benefits in the zoning code that allow you to build more FAR or whatever it might be. Don't quote me on that, but I think that that's the overall gist of it too.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have time to slide in one more question at least. Chloe, do you want to ask your question about the managed retreat, or you want me to read it?
You can read it. I just X'd it out.
Okay, no problem. So in the Climate Change Policy Guide, managed retreat is mentioned in section B9 as a policy that government entities should consider for potentially hazardous areas. In other hazards classes, we learned that this policy has been rocky in its implementation, such as in the case of the Isle de Jean Charles, is that right? Jean Charles resettlement project. From your community resilience perspective, how do governments do this in a way that is equitable, culturally sensitive, and fairly compensated?
So from my experience, I can say from, again, my time in Staten Island, after Hurricane Sandy, there was a large area along the East Shore that was essentially bought out through federal funding. And those folks were given incentive, market rate values for their homes to move elsewhere in New York City to make sure that they're staying there in the area, which is, fantastic. It is something that prioritized homeowners and not renters in the area. So that was one major glaring error. The other is that the areas in which these people were moving to likely had higher property values and were more difficult to move to. A lot of that, I think, boils down to there not being a plan in place before the impacts of the storm. They were making a reactive policy based on what happened in the area, and they were trying to do it quickly so they can get relief into the hands of people who were there. I think that having a plan for managed retreat that can be triggered by some circumstance allows that, I think, to happen in a more thoughtful way, in which you're able to have the time for community meetings, have the time for outreach, engage members of the community that aren't homeowners, who are actually, 30% of the people who lived in this area that were bought out were renters. They were essentially evicted from their homes, or they lost their homes that were managed by absentee landlords who hadn't lived there in a really long time who ended up getting the benefits from the buyout. So it's a worthy policy goal to move people out of these areas, but I think having an advanced plan in place before that, where the planning department can engage as many people as possible and make sure that it's equitable is necessary in these circumstances. And these aren't areas in which the risks are unknown. For areas that are truly considering manage or treat, you probably know the areas in those communities that are at the highest risk. You could do a lot of that work well in advance before a major storm.
Wow, great question. Great question from all of you, but I'm not sure we can slide in and have an adequate response time.